In case you didn't know or somehow haven't heard, it is the most wonderful time of the year. I'm not being sarcastic. I mean that, mostly, I think. Because there are a lot of wonderful things about this time of year. There are get-togethers with friends. There are giving things to those that you care about. There's time with family, which I feel like I should say because my in-laws came into town yesterday, so that's on the positive side. But there's also some not so wonderful things. If we're being honest, right? There's all the present shopping. There's trying to get in and then out of the Fresh Mart parking lot for, I don't know who designed that, but it was the worst ever, right? There are all of the end of the year things that we have to do. Finish up all the stuff at work, especially for us, as you can imagine. It's a busy time of year. There's school things, there's work things, there's busyness. Lots and lots of busyness. We hear wonderful phrases at this time of year, right? Like phrases that lift our spirit, like, peace on earth and goodwill towards all people. And then we hear phrases that we never want to hear again, like, can you pick up something at the mall for me, right? Or my worst, some assembly is required, all right, which is the worst phrase. So in many ways, it is the most wonderful time of the year, but in other ways, it's kind of a stressful mess out there right now. The idea of Christmas is actually sometimes better than Christmas itself. But maybe that's just the hope and the positivity in us, because we tend to do that. We tend to see things not always how they really are. Now, take, for instance, the Christmas story, the story of Jesus' birth. It is, as they say, the greatest story ever told, and yet the truth is we have somewhat unintentionally sanitized the story, domesticated, if I guess you could even say. Maybe because so often we've read it in hushed tones by candlelight, or we've seen it acted out by adorable children dressed up in costumes. Maybe we've sung hymns that we love that cast all of these events in such a rosy hue. Whatever the reason, it is very easy for us to forget that Joseph and Mary were real people. Real people. Now, in our imagination, Jesus never cried, right? He never cried. Mary looked more like a blushing young bride than someone who had just given birth. And Joseph is confident, he's calm, he's protective, he's very paternal. Everything is going great. People are having the times of their lives at this thing, even the donkey, it seems, right? It's as if we're watching this story unfold through Joseph and Mary's Instagram account or something like that. All the highlights, all the good stuff. But then I hear the story of Jesus' birth as told by the writer of the Gospel of Matthew, which is what Whitney read. And it's a very different account than the account from Luke, which is what we normally hear around Christmas Eve. Because when I hear Matthew's account, I sense something else in the story, I sense heartache. I sense worry. I sense confusion. I sense fear. There's so many compelling characters around the story of Jesus' birth. Obviously, Mary, the mother of Jesus, of course, but there's also Elizabeth and John the Baptist and Gabriel and wise men and angels and the shepherds. And understandably, the focus is usually on Mary, the mother of Jesus, and it should be. And we just sang a whole song about Mary. Besides the baby Jesus, the Bible makes clear in many ways this is Mary's story. But then somewhat unusually today, we don't hear this every year, we heard in our gospel story about Joseph. We don't often think much about Joseph. After all, it's just Joseph, right? A few years ago in the Christmas play, which we're doing tonight, as Eric said, at 5, my son was Joseph in the play. And he was really excited to get the part. He was like, I'm Joseph. This is great, right? Until he realized that in the play, Joseph doesn't do anything in the play. He doesn't even get a speaking part. He just stands there the whole time, just doing nothing, which pretty much sums up how we usually see, or I guess I should say how usually we don't see Joseph. So I want to talk a bit about Joseph this morning with the disclaimer that obviously I know Mary has the more important role here. Don't worry, I'm not about to just do that and go that way at all. Actually, that reminds me of a funny story one time. I went to visit a couple at the hospital who had just had a baby and had asked for me to come and do a blessing over the baby, which I often do. And upon arriving, by chance, I encountered the husband in the hallway first. And he said to me, "Hey, David, we had the baby, right? Things went fine. It was really stressful for me." He said, "But I'm doing okay now." All right. And I said something nice at the time. I normally do. I like to do that. But what I was thinking as I kind of stepped around him to, go in and check on how the mom was doing was, "Buddy, I have 3 kids, okay? I've been in that room 3 times. I mean, we didn't have that baby, all right? I mean, moral support is very necessary. It's very helpful. Trust me, and I'm glad you're doing okay. But let's not kid ourselves here about who did the hard part of actually carrying and having, said baby." So in no way am I downplaying the role of Mary here in this story. I want you to know that. But it is somewhat insightful and interesting to look at this story through the eyes of Joseph today. Now, if we're tempted to kind of sideline Joseph as a minor character in this Christmas narrative, the Gospel of Matthew reminds us that, in fact, Joseph's role in Jesus' birth was pivotal, really. Because it was Joseph's willingness to sort of lean into the impossible, to embrace the scandalous, to abandon his notions of holiness and in favor of God's kind of messy plan of salvation. It's Joseph doing that allowed this Christmas, this miracle of Christmas birth to actually unfold. As Matthew makes very clear, the Messiah must come from the house and the lineage of David. I mean, we hear so much about that throughout the Bible, and so it rests on Joseph, who is from the house of David, to give his name and his legitimacy to Mary's child. And if Joseph refuses, the fulfillment of all of that prophecy then comes to a halt. So what do we know about Joseph? Well, the gospel describes Joseph as a quote-unquote righteous man, which is to say that he was a man devoted to God. And he was a man concerned with clean and ethical living. And though Matthew doesn't elaborate, I think we can safely assume that Mary's fiancé, he's not a guy who likes to make waves, right? He doesn't want to call attention to himself or venture too close to controversy. He probably just wants an orderly life. He's honest. He's just a hardworking blue-collar carpenter. He probably follows the rules. He practices justice and fairness. And all he wants in exchange for that is a normal, uncomplicated life. Does he remind you of anyone you know? It sounds like most of us, doesn't it? But poor Joseph, right? I mean, as Mary tells this story, this God-fearing carpenter, he wakes up one morning to find that his entire world has been literally flipped upside down on him. His fiancée is pregnant. And he knows for sure that he is not the father, and so now he has no good options to choose from. Now, it's important for us to remember here that in Mary and Joseph's time, engagement is not a romantic declaration of intent, as it is today, right? I mean, rather, in that time, it was a legal contract binding in every respect. I mean, to be engaged or betrothed, or it's said multiple different ways, was essentially to be married without having actually moved in together and consummated the marriage. And the wedding ceremony itself was just a time to get together with friends and family and celebrate the joining of these two households. So for all intents and purposes, Mary and Joseph, they were already married. So the turmoil created by discovering that Mary was pregnant was, pretty crazy, as you can imagine. And why, as far as Joseph is concerned, it could mean only one thing, that his wife had been unfaithful. And again, we have to remember here that we are talking about a world completely different from our own, when men and women had very different roles and very different rights. And in that time, and in that place, Joseph doesn't really have any good options to choose from. Right? So if he calls attention to Mary's out-of-wedlock pregnancy, she could be stoned to death by Levitical law. If he divorces her quietly, she'll be reduced to begging or whatever else she might have to do to support herself and the child in the streets. If, on the other hand, he marries her, well, Mary's son will be Joseph's heir instead of his own biological child. And moreover, Joseph will be somewhat tainted forever by the scandal of Mary's illicit pregnancy and by her ridiculous and honestly maybe even blasphemous claim that her baby daddy is somehow God in all this, right? Matthew doesn't go into much detail here about Joseph's anguish, but think about that. And two, actually, there is something called, it's a long, weird name, the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is a book called the Gospel of James, which was an extra-canonical, meaning it's not in our Bible, but it existed at the time, from the early 2nd century. And we get a full and somewhat more harsh picture of the carpenter's pain in that book. In that text, it talks about that when Joseph sees Mary's swollen belly, he throws himself on the ground and he strikes his own face and he cries bitterly. He wonders long and hard how to respond, and he asks Mary, why she betrayed both him and God so cruelly. And again, that text isn't in our canon or in our Bible, but it's hard not to imagine a similar scene playing out between Joseph and Mary in real life. And the truth is that Joseph didn't believe Mary's story. He didn't. Why would he? Why would anyone believe a story like that? It took a visit from an angel to calm all of this down and to orient Joseph to God's intentions. And usually in the Bible, angels only show up when there's some heavy lifting that needs to be done, right? So I think it's safe to say that the months leading up to Christ's birth, they weren't one blissful baby shower after another, but they were rife and fraught with anxiety and concern and emotions. Now, all of which is to say that I think we make a mistake when we just sort of sanitize Joseph's consent, right? That we distort his humanity when we just assume that his acceptance of God's plan, it came just so easily to him. When we hold ourselves at arm's length from his humiliation and really from his doubt, what we do is we just make him the guy standing there, almost like that backdrop at the Christmas play, saying and doing nothing. In fact, what Joseph's pain shows me, too, is that God's favor is not the shiny, perfect thing that we would so often hope and want to believe it is. It's not the God of the New Testament who promises wealth and health and comfort and ease to his chosen ones. We wish that was who God was, but here we see it just isn't. Because in choosing Joseph to be Jesus' earthly father, God led, again, this quote-unquote righteous man with this impeccable reputation, God led him straight into doubt, into shame, into scandal, into controversy. God's call for Joseph required him to literally reorder everything he thought he knew about fairness and justice and goodness and purity. It required Joseph to become the talk of the town, and not in a good way. It required him to embrace a mess that he had not created, to love a woman whose story he didn't understand, to protect a baby that he didn't father, to accept an heir who is not his son. In other words, God's plan of salvation required Joseph, this quiet, cautious, status quo kind of guy, to choose precisely what he feared would happen the most. That sort of fraught, complicated, and suspicious life. Right? So much for what he wanted, that well-ordered life. I mean, what a stressful mess, full of uncertainty, full of worry, full of upheaval. But here's the thing. In some ways, I almost like this realistic version of the story better than the tamed-down domestic one. Now, why? Well, because, think about it, for us too, life is often a very stressful mess. Not just at Christmas time. Life is full of uncertainty. It's full of worry. It's full of upheaval. And we all know that. We all feel that. I mean, we all live that in our own ways. And sometimes, the truth is, God can even cause it. Not that he does it intentionally somehow to us. Don't hear that. But in the sense that, if we take our faith in God seriously and live our lives as he wants us to live them, to say and do the things he asks, and really to prioritize what God prioritizes, then the truth is that's going to put us out of step with the world around us and the people around us. So in its own way, Joseph and Mary's messy story in all its glory that's our story, which in some ways actually gives me hope. Because I know that God entered into that messy story, their story, I also know that he will enter into our stories as well. I mean, God always has and always will work through real people with real challenges. I mean, he didn't choose a fairy tale princess to bear the Savior, but an unwed peasant girl. He didn't choose a business or political success story to name and then care for Jesus, but rather a simple blue-collar man with his own doubts and questions who, wanted to do the right thing, but needed an angel to help him get there. I mean, God could have chosen any story with any characters to enter our world, but he chose this one with all of its uncertainty, with all of its worry and stress and upheaval. And he chooses our stories, even though they're full of the same things. And I wonder sometimes why. And I can't even say that I know, but perhaps it's because our stories are the perfect backdrop for his beautiful works of salvation and restoration and healing and hope and second chances. All of which is to kind of help us flesh out the name Emmanuel that Matthew draws on so beautifully from Isaiah and applies to Jesus. Emmanuel, God is with us. And that is, God is with us, coming to be with us as we are. As we are. Not as we know we should be, not as we're trying to be or have promised to be or will someday be, but with us as we are now, today, in this very moment even. And ultimately, that is the promise. And so that is the hope of this story. God came to be with and to use and accept and bless Joseph and Mary, the birth of Christ and their messy story. And so God comes to us now in Christ to be with us, to use us for good, to accept us as we are, and to bless us with God's own presence in our stories. And there's so much to this nativity story, so much to ponder, so much to think about when it comes to the surprising ways that God has gone about doing what he's done. And it's no wonder the angel Gabriel's very first words to Joseph were, "Joseph, do not be afraid." I mean, if we want to share in God's messy story, then I think those are the first words that we need to hear in our life too. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid when God's work in your life looks alarmingly different than you thought it would. I mean, do not be afraid when God upends your cherished assumptions about who is righteous and who is not. Don't be afraid when God asks you to Stand alongside the scandalous, the defiled, the suspected, the shamed. Do not be afraid when God asks you to love something or someone more than your own spotless reputation. Do not be afraid of the precarious, the fragile, the vulnerable. Do not be afraid of the impossible. Do not be afraid of the mess, because the mess is where God is born. Hard to believe, an event we will celebrate in just a few short days. And in light of that, in light of Emmanuel being born into our mess, I guess it really is the most wonderful time of the year.